Kyle remembered every detail of that memorable conversation. He remembered it all so well, as if it happened yesterday and not 20 years ago. Even now, Vanessa's tear-stained face and her eyes full of condemnation stood before his eyes. "I just really can't do this now. My father arranged for me to get an internship in one of the countries in Western Europe, so I can't stay with you." Kyle tried to justify himself. Of course, Vanessa understood everything. By and large, she was taking this step under the pressure from her fiancé. Terminating a pregnancy is a hard decision to make, but the young woman had already made up her mind and was going to see it through to the end. "Don't be mad at me. I'm sorry it had to happen this way," Kyle added after thinking for a bit. He knew that in a few hours, he would be in one of the countries of Western Europe and wouldn't see Vanessa for at least a couple of years. But before going to the airport, he wanted to clear things up once and for all. A child would be a burden for him at that time in his life, and he understood it perfectly well. But Vanessa wanted to keep the baby and not have to worry about how she would raise the child. Having decided that Vanessa understood him, Kyle said goodbye and grabbed a cab. At that moment, he was sure that burning all the bridges was the only right move for him. Trying to ignore the silent reproach frozen in Vanessa's eyes, the young man got into the car that arrived for him and went to the airport. Of course, Kyle had no idea how deeply he'd hurt Vanessa, who felt abandoned and unwanted. Then, 20 years ago, the young man truly believed that he'd made the right decision and solved the problem that would cause them both a lot of trouble. But now, so many years later, the man wasn't feeling so sure about it. "I wonder where Vanessa is now. How is she? Did she get married or is she still single?" he thought, sitting with the cup of coffee in the kitchen. During this time, he achieved great success in business and had everything he used to dream of in his youth. Unfortunately, this is the only visible side of the coin, but the other side wasn't as great. First of all, Kyle's personal life wasn't exactly perfect. Sure, there were women in his life, and quite a few actually, but none of them ever made him want to get married or start a family. Most of the women in Kyle's life were attracted to his money, which he had a lot of thanks to several branches of his company located throughout the country. By the age of 45, Kyle became quite sentimental and therefore often thought about his past. He even tried to find Vanessa a couple of times, but he never succeeded. When he was 25 years old, he dreamed of becoming successful and independent. But the truth was that Kyle ruined his personal life and alienated the only woman he ever truly loved. It was only much later that Kyle realized that he didn't want anyone other than Vanessa. No beauties from modeling magazines could replace the woman who stole his heart many years ago. Of course, a lot of time had passed, and Kyle's feelings should have faded away, but the reality was very different. Looking through the old photos, Kyle mentally immersed himself in the time when he was young, ambitious, and full of energy. Back then, the young man felt that the whole world would lie at his feet, and women would shower the road in front of him with rose petals. It was mostly because of his arrogance that the young man decided to take such a drastic step. If it happened now, he would have never asked Vanessa to terminate the pregnancy. But back then, he didn't see it as anything special or scary. If Vanessa had kept the child, they'd be 20 years old now. I could hand over the reins of my company to my son or daughter, teach them everything I know. We could go fishing together or something, Kyle thought with tears in his eyes. The man always kept his mental wounds a secret, and not even his closest friends knew about them. Kyle's only outlet was his business. To a certain extent, it was like a child to Kyle. It needed to be raised, to have Kyle invested in its development. And now, going to the airport, Kyle tried to stay focused on the important negotiations that were to be held in New York. Kyle had always been known as a talented negotiator, and therefore, if he took up the case, he usually succeeded. That was one of the reasons why his subordinates respected him so much. They felt that he was great at his job. There were a lot of people at the airport, mainly because everyone was on their way to celebrate Independence Day with their families. People hurried to see their relatives and visit their mothers, fathers, and children. Having arrived at the check-in desk, Kyle started patiently waiting for his turn. Inadvertently, looking at the people hurrying in all directions, Kyle saw a woman whose face seemed vaguely familiar. At first, the man decided that he was simply mistaken, but when he looked more closely, he realized that there could be no mistake. It was Vanessa who was standing a few yards away from him. Kyle's ex-fiance hadn't changed much over the years, and only the wrinkles in the corners of her eyes spoke of her age and the toll the years had taken on her. However, that wasn't what surprised Kyle the most. It was the fact that Vanessa was there with a young man who looked exactly like young Kyle. The young man was about 20 years old. He had sky-blue eyes, golden hair, and a radiant smile on a slightly elongated, aristocratic face. At that moment, Kyle forgot about everything in the world. He was no longer worried about the upcoming negotiations, checking in for his flight, and pretty much everything else in his life. The man was ready to scream for joy at the sight of Vanessa and her companion. For some unknown reason, Kyle was sure that the young man standing next to his ex-fiance was his son. He didn't know how it was possible, but he felt that it was some kind of a miracle and couldn't help but smile. When Kyle met Vanessa's eyes, he suddenly began to doubt if he was actually right. Vanessa literally looked through him and made it perfectly clear that she didn't know the man standing in front of her. Kyle stepped closer and then asked, "Vanessa, is that you?" The woman gave the stranger an appraising look, after which she said, "Yes, my name is Vanessa, but I don't know you. You must have made a mistake." At that moment, Kyle was ready to swear to God that it was his Vanessa standing right in front of him. He'd recognized the voice of his ex-fiance among hundreds of thousands of other voices and simply couldn't have been mistaken. After the staring contest, Vanessa headed for the check-in desk. All this time, the young man walked beside her and supported her by the hand. Kyle tried to stop them, but Vanessa's companion suddenly pushed him back sharply. "What do you want, sir? My mother told you you've made a mistake, so please stop harassing us," the man said irritably. "Calm down, Vincent. It's all right. Go take a walk, or better yet, have a cup of tea at the cafe." Vanessa changed her anger to mercy. At that moment, Kyle realized that she did it on purpose so she could talk to him. This time, Vanessa was the first one to break the silence. "I thought that you wouldn't recognize me. I first noticed you back at the entrance," the woman said with a smile. Instead of answering, Kyle smiled and shook his head. There was only one thing the man wanted to talk about at that moment. Most of all, he just wanted to ask one question. Was Vincent his son or not? Since they felt uncomfortable talking by the check-in desk, Vanessa suggested that they should sit on a bench so they wouldn't get in the way of the other passengers as they talked. Vanessa started her story from afar, going back 20 years ago, when she didn't do it as her fiancé asked, but listened to her heart instead. "What did you do?" Kyle exclaimed. "I didn't terminate the pregnancy and listened to my parents. Fortunately, my mother knew many stories of women who couldn't have children after getting an abortion. Therefore, I moved to another city and decided to raise Vincent on my own. Of course, it was hard at first, but then I got used to it and actually enjoyed being a mother." "But why didn't you tell me?" Kyle exclaimed with resentment in his voice. Vanessa smiled and shook her head. Kyle understood her without words. After all, it was him who told Vanessa 20 years ago that he was leaving for 2 years for an internship in Europe and wasn't ready to be a father. Vanessa always knew how to read between the lines and understood perfectly well that he was saying goodbye forever. Moreover, Kyle's parents were against their relationship, as they hoped that their son would marry someone from a wealthy family. Vanessa kept talking and talking. She was very proud and happy that she had managed to raise such a great son on her own. Kyle was attending university, and according to his professors, he showed great promise in the field of IT. Kyle listened to Vanessa as if spellbound. It seemed to the man that he was stuck in a fairy tale where everything turned upside down. All this time, he was convinced that he didn't have children and that he probably never would. And then it turned out that Vanessa made the right decision 20 years ago and acted like a real mother. At the end of her story, Vanessa suddenly turned sad. Her face turned pale, and the wrinkles at the corners of her eyes seemed to have gotten deeper. "What's wrong? Are you sick?" Kyle asked sympathetically. "Yes, no, I'm fine now. It's just that my illness has been progressing for the last 6 months, so I could die pretty much any day now," Vanessa answered with a sad sigh. "What about treatment? Isn't there anything that can be done?" Kyle asked immediately. In response, the woman shrugged her shoulders, thus letting Kyle know that the conversation was over. But Kyle already got an idea in his head. He wanted to get Vanessa a consult at one of the best medical centers in New York. Taking his beloved woman by the hand, Kyle tried to convince her that it was all the right move for her. Vanessa's first thought was to reject his offer. Of course, she still had feelings for Kyle. She never married and devoted her life to raising Vincent. But now that Vanessa had a heart-to-heart with Kyle, everything seemed much better than it was at the beginning of their conversation. Therefore, after some persuasion from Kyle, Vanessa agreed to accept his help, especially since she was sure that she was terminally ill. Upon learning that the man wanted to help his mother, Vincent gave him a grateful look. 3 days later, Vanessa was already being examined at one of the best medical centers in the country. It was there that it turned out that a medical mistake had been made. The poor woman was misdiagnosed and her disease turned out to be completely treatable. Thus, thanks to the timely therapy, Vanessa recovered quickly. Vincent and Kyle took turns staying by Vanessa's side throughout her treatment, so that the woman was never alone in the hospital. About a month later, Vanessa was discharged from the clinic, and according to her doctors, she was completely healthy. During this time, she didn't only forgive Kyle, but even grew to respect him. It was only then that she found the strength to tell Vincent that Kyle was actually his father. Tears welled up in the young man's eyes. Vincent lived his life convinced that his father had died a long time ago, and now he simply couldn't believe what he was being told. Kyle understood that Vincent would soon get used to the new reality, in which he'd have not only a mother, but also a father. It would seem that this would make a great ending to the story. But the truth is that it had its continuation 2 years later, when Kyle came to pick Vanessa up from the hospital after she had 2 beautiful babies. It seemed like a real miracle to everyone around them. But Kyle knew that it was a gift from God for realizing his mistakes and being able to correct them even 20 years later.